Welcome to the Essential Libertarians. I'm your host, Kareem, giving you the tools you need for self-governance. Today we have returning an amazing voluntarist who is part of Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. And I want to welcome him back to the show. We had a great show before. Keith, how you doing?
Kareem, I'm doing fine. Thank you for having me back.
Yeah, definitely come back anytime. All volunteers are always welcome on the show, as well as classical liberals, people on the right, people on the left. I want to hear your perspectives. I don't like echo chambers. If you want to keep the Ron Paul revolution going, the ideals of Murray Rothbard alive, check out the LP Mises Caucus. Our message is simple: no more wars, lockdowns, bailouts, or mandates. You're an individual. You have the ability to decide what's best for yourself. And you can learn more about us from our resources here. So, Keith, I'm sure you've been taking a look, if you have, at different things that are going on. I want to focus particularly on Europe because I'd like to kind of get your thoughts, particularly about what's going on in Austria and what's going on around the world. So Austria, if you don't know, sorry for the pop-ups there, they basically said, I think at the beginning, well, if you get this procedure, if you do what we say, you'll be good. We'll give you your freedom back. If you jump through these hoops, we'll give you freedom back. And I think a lot of people like you and me warned that you can jump through infinite hoops. They'll make more and more and more. And that's what I keep telling people. I'm not going to judge anybody who, maybe got scared and said, hey, I need to do it for my job. But I'm telling you, I told people, hey, there'll just be more and more and more. So there's demonstrations now in the Netherlands that has erupted for a third night in a row. The biggest one, I think, is Austria, though. They shut down the whole country. They said everybody has to get this procedure. It doesn't matter. Not just like here. I mean, Biden's bad enough, don't get me wrong, with the healthcare workers and stuff like that. But they're just saying everybody who exists in Austria, you have to get it. So it's the first country to make COVID, medical procedure a legal requirement. And people can't really do anything about it now, except, in my opinion, protest back and do civil disobedience. That was my first thing. But I'm kind of curious that even though it's not in America, I believe stuff like this could happen here. I'm not one of those, it can't happen here, it can't happen here. And I'd love to hear your solution to, like, if your whole country, like Austria, locks down, what do you do? Because I know elites are going to look at Austria, Australia, other countries and say, ooh, I like this. We could do this here. Everybody's not complying. We did the 100-person requirement, I think. The OSHA got blocked. We're just lock everything down, make it a requirement. I know we have guns here, but love to hear your perspective on how do we beat this and what are some things people can do.
Well, like many other things, you run into the market failure issue of, which is not bashing the free market. It simply just means that individual rationality does not always equal group rationality. So it might be good for all of us to forcefully resist. However, I can't directly control even you, let alone 330 million others. I can only directly control myself and indirectly control others. So the cost to me might be very, very, very high. And the benefit might be very small in the short run or the long run. And it's very easy to talk yourself out of standing your ground. You might say, well, it's going to be so much easier and I'm buying time and I'll, be able to do things I otherwise wouldn't be able to. What if I go to jail? I'm not going to be some martyr like, Gandhi or anything. People aren't going to be, writing about me. The news is going to be focused on 100 other things before I am able to get my day in court. So therefore, I'm just going to comply. That is the main problem. So one of the solutions to this would simply be what you could refer to as social proof. So once one or two people do something, it makes it much more likely that other people are likely to embrace the idea because they're simply saying, other people do it. It is possible. I'm not alone. Therefore, I feel much more comfortable than I otherwise would if I had just thought, I was the only one who had considered such things. Best example of this. Think of It was probably, I think, December. So Biden had been, gosh, I forget if Biden had been elected or if he was just running. He had said, part of my first 100 days is going to be a nationwide mask mandate. And he never had that executive order. He just didn't go through with it, even though he was talking about it. Well, the reason that that didn't go through is you would have seen such mass noncompliance that it would have actually hit to the very legitimacy of what else can we get away with? They tell us we have to do this thing. A lot of people disobey, and it's fine. What else can we do? Think of the fireworks ban in California on July 4th, 2019. If you remember, people in airplanes as they're landing on California, there were way more fireworks than you're used to seeing because, America's not really big on, the celebration of the 4th in places like California, as far as I know. But it was so widely disregarded that the elites say, well, we need to start picking and choosing what we enforce. Because if we're seen as, people who pass laws, but they don't get respected, well, then our legitimacy decreases every single time. So when you look at a group of people who are in suits and speaking clearly and all clapping and passing laws and they're elevated, that sort of, conveys respect and I should obey these people. But when you see QAnon shaman with his with his helmet on in that very same place, you go, this place is kind of a joke. So that's why he gets 41 months, a large portion of which was in solitary, because you're delegitimizing the state. So those are just things off the top of my head that you could probably do to increase social proof, to increase the incentive for other people to see that it's okay to not, you don't even have to say resist. You could say mass non-compliance. You saw the OSHA thing that, it was like everywhere. The employer mandates are coming everyone with 500 or more employees, and then it was 100 or more, and you saw it everywhere, and then you just stopped hearing about it. I had to look into it, and that was actually repealed. What is it? Repealed, overturned by court decision. So they tell you this big thing is coming, so you operate as though that's the way reality is, and they don't even make the wall-to-wall coverage. I'm sure it was reported, but not even close to how it was originally talked about. So the fear that other people will not obey is where so much of our power at this moment comes from. It's doing everything from, delegitimizing the legislators by laughing at them, even ratioing them on social media. That has to do something. And unless you're like, going to do something majestic instead, well, that takes 2 seconds to make a comment that, maybe you'll get 150 impressions on. It's a lot more than just, thinking your thoughts in the shower that no one hears. So, little things like that to sort of chip away at the legitimacy of the state and tell others it's okay to think like this.
Oh, I love that answer, especially the mass non-compliance. I also want to add to that and ask you before we get into the second thing. I think it's important that people don't comply, and maybe we'll beat this, but then I feel like that it's not like the elites are going to say, well, okay, we lost here. I'm done. They'll come back, or somebody will come back. Or even if you got rid of these elites, which a lot of people say, okay, you put, Fauci's gone and all these people are gone. Okay, well, there's still bad people in the world just because you get rid of one organization. So I think it's important, as Peter T. Leeson said in his old speeches, that studying this is not a luxury. And he said the developing world needs to have the discussion. Now, I would add, because of these mandates, because of everything going on, because of the rise in authoritarianism, the Western world, the developed world, needs to have the discussion on what anarchy is now, which I like the way he defines it. I like Murray Rothbard's definition. I like Michael Malice's definition, but I think he does the best, where he says it's simply a different system of providing rules of social order. And I would add, it's a decentralized system of providing rules and maintaining and creating rules of social order. So I think it's also important that not only mass non-compliance, but then pull people away, like, even people like get European viewers, Australian viewers, all of them, and say, look, I get it. Don't comply, beat this thing. But if you want a permanent solution, not a Band-Aid on just your finger or on your arm, then what you need to do is figure out how social cooperation works without a massive state or a very small state. I think that's also the big thing, because a lot of people are saying just don't comply and then you'll beat it, and you might beat it, like OSHA beat it, but temporarily maybe. But I think that's the also important thing. I was kind of curious your thoughts on that. Is like, hey, okay, we beat this. Can we have a discussion about what anarchy really is? Not trying to put another Democrat in, not trying to put another Republican in, not Trumpism, not any of this. But what the heck is anarchy really? Because a lot of people, I still think it's either chaos or think it's something directly related to people like Antifa.
Yeah, I would say anarchy is a society in which there is no general recognition for the initiation of aggression against peaceful people. That definition, I would say, is the small improvement. I'm sure if I had a pen and time to correct myself, I could perfect it. But simply, society without a government doesn't get to the root, because what makes government the illegitimate organization that it is it simply claims this right to initiate aggression that no one else has. That's its unique defining feature. So whether it's me kidnapping you or me hiring the state to do so, on both levels, it's not just government bad, it's aggression bad, whether it's me or a group of me or a group of us with a lot of power called government, or well, if we have a little power, or if we're roaming. So that really gets to the heart of the issue. Archon meaning ruler, and being the root word without rulers. So no person having the right to rule over another, I would see as a consistent application of anarchy. One of the great benefits of this philosophy is it does not say there shouldn't be bad people, and instead of having elites, you won't have bad people. I'm trying to think of how our opponents would phrase it. What the anarchist voluntarist would recognize is that bad people exist. It's a constant under any sort of system. So under which system, if these bad people exist, under which system would we like to have them so we could allocate their greed into the service of others? And you see this perfectly with guys like Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Steve Jobs. By a lot of accounts, these guys were total jerks. However, through a market process, they couldn't get a penny out of our pockets unless they created something of value we wanted to voluntarily exchange for. They couldn't get a second of our time unless we chose to work for them, or, invest our time in reading whatever things they have so we could invest our money with them. That is the great check and balance the voluntary society has that the state does not. Because you can even with those very same people, Rockefeller and Carnegie, they're able to go to the state and get protectionism in such a way they otherwise wouldn't. The main example would be with their 501c3s. Renee Wormser wrote a book, Foundations, Their Power and Influence. And it was mainly how these people were able to influence the state in ways they otherwise would not have been able to if people were able to opt out of associating with them, or if they faced competition. So just as the airlines should not be able to get a penny out of our pockets unless we say, yeah, I like your services, so I'm going to associate with you. What they do instead of focusing on pleasing the customer, they're able to please the state. They're able to get this huge subsidy, this huge bailout at the beginning of the lockdowns. If you remember, the airlines were one of the big ones.
Yeah.
And I heard one guy on CNBC say that this was a bad idea. Everyone else was explaining that this was legit. Now, that's not a scientific study that's saying there are not a lot of people who grasp the importance of this. They also think that, well, if someone gets bailed out, or if there's no bailout and the airline company goes out of business, well, then you don't have the planes and you don't have the pilots. No, what happens is they come under new management and they're more efficient than they otherwise would be, and prices might come down because they have they have a lot of money to make up. They want to attract new customers. They're more competitive. So anarchy it's not just this pie in the sky philosophy. It recognizes bad people exist, and the way to put their badness in service of others is to make sure there is a institutional recognition of self-ownership, voluntary exchange, and private property. Did that get to the root of what you're asking?
Yeah, definitely, and I think that got to the root, and I think it's time to play Mark Passio's word association game. When I say anarchy, what comes to mind? Say freedom or chaos, and if you can get more people to start saying freedom or no masters, no rulers, that's a start. And then I would back it up with stuff like Leeson's thing, because I know people are going to have questions, and that's why I really like his work. Because I'm like, okay, here's an example where there was direct threats of violence, but nobody actually fell into complete chaos. Even though there was a lot of issues, they figured it out. And these are people who like brings up a lot of good examples. So I think that's going to be prevalent. Okay, so the second story is actually a good story. I think we got good news. I really like what's going on here, mainly because after the election, after Trump lost, talked to a lot of his supporters, and I said, hey, I'm not either of the sides, and I guess people get confused because everybody has to play red or versus blue. It's like Halo. And then when I explain to them I'm a libertarian, a voluntarist, or ANCAP, they're like, well, what's that? And we start going down like the drug war, this, like, and at the end of the day, I'm like, well, we've been here talking here 25, 30 minutes. What do you think about defunding the Pentagon? They're like, well, if you could do it, how would you do it? And I'm like, probably have each state have its own militia, right? It's not complete anarchy, but hey, each state having its own militia, it's kind of close, right? We're getting closer. It's not Rothbardian, but we're getting closer. So I saw this, and I finally found the article. I mentioned it on a previous show. What happened is the Oklahoma National Guard, they say, goes rogue, but really they just say we're not taking this procedure. And their commander said they're not doing the mandate, they're not doing anything, and then the Pentagon got mad. Basically, what happened is the Biden administration's having another bad week, as they say. Did they have a good one? One day before the appeals in court against Biden's medical procedure, the Oklahoma National Guard rescinded the Pentagon's requirement that service members receive this procedure. And basically what he said is that no Oklahoma guardsman will be required to take this. It reads that Governor Stitt, I believe that's how you say his name, is the force's lawful commander-in-chief when not mobilized by the federal government. I think that's important. No negative administration or legal action will be taken against the guardsmen who refuse to take it. So actually, I think this is interesting because he can say, hey, we're not going to take it, but here's the thing. The Pentagon said they were going to respond appropriately to the memo. Basically, Secretary Austin, who is the defense secretary, said, oh, well, I think, you have to get it. That means you're ready. And Stitt previously said the Department of Defense is not going to enforce the mandate. Air National Guard members, and in November 2 letter cited by Massino Stitt said 10% of the state's troops had refused this procedure and the mandate was irresponsible. So finally, Mark Passio has always talked about order followers and stuff like that, always just following through. And I'm like, okay, fine. If there is a hill to stop, if there is a time where you hit a brick wall and you say no, just like, no, I feel this is the time. And I'm like, kind of like, come on, guys. And but this kind of makes me like, okay, I have a little bit more faith in humanity restored. It's like a meter right now. Like some days it goes all the way down, some days it goes up, some days it goes back. And then the National Guard troops do belong to their governors when not mobilized by the Pentagon, which I think they should belong to their governors regardless till we can figure out how to decentralize that. Federal requirements often supersede any state use of the Guard as their senior leaders. That's because the majority of Guard funding, training, equipment comes from the federal government. It's not clear whether the order will jeopardize the funding. Title 32 of the U.S. Code that pertains to the National Guard includes a section that specifies states do not comply with Title 32 regulations, forfeit their federal funding for the Guard. It's not clear whether this mandate meets that legal threshold. So I'm actually going to stop there because I'm not going to get into the legal things. And this is pretty complicated, but here's what I will say. I personally think it would be great, because I made the argument. Well, people say I want a strong military. I said, what about a militia? A militia is just as good if they work, or if I don't like saying the word belong to the governors, but if they're serving the governors, it's not Rothbardian, in my opinion. It's more Patrick Henry-ish, if we're trying to find a word. It's more minarchist, but I think it's a good step in the right direction. And funny enough, these mandates seem to be having the opposite effect, where they're like, okay, now we're going to push back. We're not going to take it. And we're just the Oklahoma National Guard now. We don't want to play with the feds. And to me, if you get 20 or 30 states saying, I don't want to work with the feds anymore, I don't need your funding, I don't need anything, I'm just going to work for DeSantis, I'm going to work for Neom, I'm going to work for whoever the governor of Pennsylvania is. Heck, I'm going to be under Susan Hochul, which is kind of scary, but whatever, in New York. Okay. I think that's a step in the right direction. It's not ideal, but I'll take what I can get after 2020. But I'd love to hear your thoughts. Should it go like, is state militias a good step? Is that the end step? Would you like to see it further? Or am I wrong here? Is this bad news, actually?
Well, state militias would not be the end step, because they certainly involve a state by definition. Well, when the Constitution refers to a state being necessary for the security of a free state, it's my understanding that they were just talking about a state of being, as in any arrangement between individuals, not necessarily the state or the government. Um, it's important to remember that what makes the state illegitimate is it claims the right to contract with people who don't consent to it, and it claims the right to use or tax or control property it hasn't acquired through voluntary exchange or original appropriation. That again is that defining characteristic. It's not big or small. The because you could have grassroots tyranny. You could have, Pol Pot all alone in Cambodia with no influence from the United Nations. Well, just because that's like a really small area doesn't mean it's freedom. If your neighbor murders you, that's worse than all the taxes that a state could impose. So it's not necessarily size. One of the great benefits of something like this, though, is you have less mass centralization, because just the economics of while you can reap great benefits from centralizing and working with others, it also tends to multiply human errors, and there's probably less accountability than there otherwise would be. I'm still waiting for people to be held accountable for this 20-year Afghan war that cost trillions of dollars, thousands of lives, and in 11 days, the Taliban took over the entire place. Did we even get an apology from the Pentagon? Sorry about the money. Sorry about all the
No.
wasted time
Yeah.
and
They,
effort. Of course not.
They killed.
And who do you point the finger at? Bush, Trump, Obama, the chiefs of staff. You can easily point the finger at all of them, but they still get their still get their parades. What were you going to say?
Oh, I was going to say they killed the aid worker, and they're just like, well, we investigated ourselves, and we killed the aid worker and his like 5 or 6 kids, and I guess we messed up, And the funny thing I keep telling people is they're like, this corporation's bad, this and this. I'm like, some of these corporations work with the government, but let's say they're completely private. I'm not saying a corporation would never hurt anybody, but at least they'd be more accountable when that stuff happens. It's, oh, we investigated ourselves. We messed up. I don't think you'll ever get an apology. I don't think we ever got an apology, heck, for the Iraq War going back, for Vietnam, for Korea, for anything. I don't think they ever admitted, and I'm not necessarily an Alex Jones big supporter, but I don't think they even admitted that they knew about Pearl Harbor. So I'm not real optimistic on that. The only way they'd apologize probably is if they lose central power and things get declassified, and they have no power. And I'm like, hey, Pelosi, I have these documents and you're no longer in Congress. You want to level with me here? Like, and maybe you get an apology. I'm saying maybe. They're still psychopaths. They'll be like, whatever, I don't care. Like Hillary Clinton, I don't think is ever going to say sorry for what she did to Gaddafi. I just don't see it. She wants to go after cryptocurrencies now. So I don't see these
Very
people.
unlikely. Exactly. They're much more likely to double down. The reason that recognizing they haven't apologized is to say that these people have no interest or incentive to actually get it right in the future. So to say that we need centralized power and then we have to focus on really making it work. Well, the average person doesn't have much of an incentive. The actors involved, Pelosi, all the names you just mentioned, well, they don't have an incentive. When they're wrong, they don't have mass firings. Even not only that, when it's proven that they've screwed up, the NSA isn't spying on anyone. Okay, they're spying on everyone. No departments get defunded. Usually, after something like 9/11, Bush's approval rating skyrocketed to 90 something percent, and the power of the federal government drastically increased. So the incentives are the opposite. So whenever it comes to a problem exists, whether it's ignorance, terrorism, crime, something like that, you're putting power in the hands of people who pay no price for being wrong at a minimum. They usually get rewarded for being wrong. So when it comes to big versus small, smaller is just generally better when we're talking about something like a state that's just illegitimate. Because even though you could have 50 Pol Pots, well, if you had one Pol Pot, that I guess would just be the same thing, but you could still get some places of freedom. It lowers exit costs. So while I can always go to Mexico or Canada or Argentina, it's much more costly than for me to go to Texas or New Mexico. So there's still a cost involved in both, but because the cost is so much higher, I'm much less likely to engage in the activity. So people are more likely to live with the tyranny the more centralized it is. So what I would say to the order followers you mentioned, of course, Pasio's right about how they hold more moral culpability, especially because they're volunteers. If we're talking about people in Vietnam who were enslaved by the draft, that's more of a risky topic and a tough area. But let's just talk about right now.
Here's what I'm saying essentially. I'll give you an example. Like if you know Larkin Rose, I really love Larkin Rose, all his stuff. Government's a religion. He made me realize that, all that kind of stuff. After the election, I went into his chat and he was talking, I think, about Trump and the cheating, and there's not like tons and tons of whether you think there's evidence or not. I'm not getting into that. But he was talking about that. They were talking, people were talking about Biden, and I said, like, hey guys, like support everything, like Larkin, this is spot on. And they were talking about not voting. I'm like, well, I did vote for Jo Jorgensen. I didn't think she was perfect. I found some of her comments cringy, but I vote for her. And they're like, well, Jorgensen's a statist, Kareem. I'm like, I get that. She's more of a minarchist to me if I had to put her in one of those boxes you have behind, or bins behind you. That's where I throw it. And Spike Cohen's an anarchist. But I said, like, look, not. I love agorists, by the way. But my fundamental question is, I don't see a point from here to there. Like if someone, I do have like a logical mind of like, okay, if you tell me about a cryptocurrency or software, I want to see how you're going to like dot it out. That's why I think I like Leeson a lot, because he gives examples. Here's how it works. Here's what you can do. Here's how you progressively get there. Here's how you promote social cooperation and whittle it down. Compare this to this, compare first world to first world, see what it looks like. The problem I have with like, okay, Jorgensen's a statist and stuff like that is I want to progressively get there and say, okay, the state's having a militia is not perfect. It's still a state, but it's a little closer. It's a little closer. Like to me, a lot of the hard part I have with the agorists is like, how do you get to this Rothbardian or this free market society? How do you get from here to there? I don't see it. I don't see like, okay, you can say the state's illegitimate, and me and you both agree, but how do you get there? To me, I'm like, okay, well, the National Guard leaves Oklahoma. That's a step. Pennsylvania says we're going to nullify things. That's why we're a step. Maybe one state leaves and say we're going to do Articles of Confederation for 10, 20 years. That's not anarchy, but it's a step. Then we say, okay, maybe local municipalities can declare autonomy. And that's closer. And then individuals can declare autonomy. But to me, it kind of happens in steps. It's not just like, okay, Biden's gone. Can we go for Rothbardian? Like, does that make sense? Is what I'm saying make sense? And these are ANCAP.
Yeah. So Konkin's plan, if I remember, in either the new Libertarian Manifesto or an Agorist Primer, his general idea was that you're going to see great inefficiencies with these highly centralized command economies. And even if you go towards places where the economies are more free, there's still a lot of regulation. You'll have lower costs in the black market overall because you won't have to comply with all of this regulatory nonsense. However, you in some areas might get higher prices because there's a risk of running into the cops. However, after time, more money circulates in these places, so they have more power and they have more influence and they can interact with more people, which increase their influence over time to the point where they're going to see value in protecting this property of theirs. So, whether it's, you're selling, I hate to use the drugs example because it's so predictable, but let's just say that at some point you as the property owner are going to say it's worth a portion of my assets to allocate to defending this. So much as like getting an alarm system is individuals taking the steps, or having a gun or having a knife or having pepper spray. That is private self-defense. This is going to increase to people coming together for purposes of self-defense, and eventually will get so big they'll be able to recognize the state as an aggressor and fend off this aggressor state, and that is sort of how you would get there. That is my recollection of the agorist explanation of how you get from here
Yeah.
to there.
Okay. Okay. And I can kind of see that. The hard part is that that's very high level. It's kind of like saying, like, hey, Keith, I want to design a software. And you're like, okay, what features do you want? I'm like, yeah, I kind of want a website. I want it to have buttons and I want to make money. You're like, oh, okay, like you kind of like give me more and that's kind of why like I got into anarcho-capitalism, so I could be like, okay, here's the folk theorem. If you combine it with this, I see there's a lot of Muslims in Dearborn, Michigan. They can do Sharia and this thing. Okay, but that's not going to work for the majority. If we pair English common law and these things, see how social cooperation works here, get like statistics, and then be like, okay, social cooperation has this much social welfare compared to this. We can conclude that first best works here better, first best works here. And that to me is kind of like what I'm seeing now with the Oklahoma National Guard. It's slowly whittling down stuff. Like I'm right now, to be honest, even though I'm a voluntarist, I'm not arguing for Murray Rothbard stuff particularly. I'm arguing for the Articles of Confederation. Like the Anti-Federalists had a point. Let's just try that first. Let's get to point anti-federalist before we get to point voluntarist, if that makes sense. Because then I can say, look, a smaller decentralized state works. China hasn't come over. We've all agreed to some kind of defense. We're good. The world hasn't ended. Let's decentralize a little more. And then, look, the world hasn't ended. Kind of like if you came to me and you're like, I want to be like a bodybuilder. Like, okay, lift these weights. Okay, I got that. Okay, now I can bench 200. You're like, but you say I want to bench like 3. Okay, well, start 250. Because to me, if you just say, okay, from where we are right now, let's privatize everything. They're like, I can't. Nobody could really see that unless someone who's like in love with the philosophy, like in my opinion, I could be totally wrong.
Yeah, and people like Rothbard even warned against, something that eventually happened. He wrote about it in the 70s in For a New Liberty, but it happened in the Soviet Union, where the state had owned a ton of property illegitimately, and then they just sold it to one of to a Kremlin crony, and then it's like, well, it's almost a state in the sense it hasn't gone through original appropriation and voluntary exchange. Rothbard's example was, imagine the state just before disbanding itself gave Kentucky to the Kennedys and New York to the Rockefellers. After they disband themselves, would we have a moral obligation to respect the rules and rents in these area? And his answer is no, because they haven't gone through the original appropriation voluntary exchange process. They're just as illegitimate as the Louisiana purchasing property with other people's money that the people didn't have a right to sell in the first place. So yeah, you also have to recognize that South Korea is a better place to live than North Korea. West Germany was better than East Germany. So the idea that we need to have both short-term and long-term goals is vitally important. Just as the elites are not just planning a day in advance, and they're not only planning 50 years in advance. They have short-term goals, medium-term goals, long-term goals. So yeah, medium could be the militia attempt to arrange things, but smaller isn't always better. Sometimes it pays to cooperate with other organizations. So you still want to have that long view in play. One of the main problems with the empiricism only approach to say, well, let's see if it works. When you're dealing with a media and a populace that's educated by this cathedral, more or less, they're almost unable completely to determine what it means to see whether or not something works. For example, they'll say, well, isolationism doesn't work. So, right there, they think not aggressing against nations means you're isolated, which is as dumb as saying, if I'm not invading my neighbor's house, I'm isolated from him. Of course, you could trade with them and you can have diplomacy. So, they'll say, isolationism doesn't work. Look at Pearl Harbor and 9/11. So that is them thinking something works. And it takes a lot of energy to educate people. Whereas if you start from the spot that if I don't have the right to do it, how can I designate or delegate this right to a congressman? That I see as our best long-term hope to delegitimize this thing. It's not about teaching everyone where we stand on education, then healthcare, then the environment, and then agricultural subsidies, and then the minimum wage. No one's ever going to be able to grasp all that man economy and state depth that it would be nice for them to. The main thing is teaching them that political authority, initiating aggression, is wrong for everyone, and there's no exceptions for any group. So, yeah, I see that as the most likely long-term solution. Even today, you can see that, if people say racism is bad, they won't say, well, imperialism and racism, I'd have to check the GDP numbers and well, let's see if Jim Crow worked. I'd have to look at blacks before and after and see how they would have done otherwise. They're easily convinced by it's inherently wrong. No argument will be tolerated for the opposition. We could easily do that. I'm sorry, not easily. We have the capacity to do that because we can see it take place in other forms. It's going to take a while, but then again, people believed in a lot of gods throughout history that they don't believe in now. And in 66 or 63, there were only 15 of us in Murray Rothbard's apartment. Now there's Anarchapulco, there's the LP conventions all over where there's tons of ANCAPs. There was a meeting at a bar in Arizona recently that I went to. There more ANCAPs there than there were on the planet a few decades ago. So don't lose total hope.
No, I'm not losing hope. I'm just asking like an empirical based approach versus a moral approach. Because sometimes I do like to see like, okay, well, under this, because even I could maybe slightly like I can kind of even live with the art. I could live with the argument because even some people do make it, and I do live it, like not the Nozick's invisible hand, but in a minarchist society, maybe in a first world, might be able to beat an ANCAP society in production and stuff, maybe. But the only thing I'd argue is the minarchist society in 200 years is going to turn into a tyranny. I mean, it took us from one president. We literally, in the span of 250 years, went from give me liberty or death to show me your documentation to get basic services. So that's what I'd argue. Yeah, you might lose a little bit in the general welfare, but I think overall you'll be better in the long term. I was going to do one more, if that's cool, just to talk about Leeson's work, particularly because I'm a huge fan. So he made the argument, especially in the developing world. Like if we forget about the first world, in the developing world, there's a whole. You've heard the phrase, "Would you push the button?" Yeah, and he says he might be hesitant before the whole thing that's happening here in the United States to push the button because it could depress social welfare and general welfare a lot. But he said, like, okay, in other countries like Somalia, Sudan, Swaziland, Uganda, not that the fundamental difference between people be different, but in places where government is super highly predatory, where they're just like, if I'm taking your stuff, I'm taking your stuff, and the police basically will help. Um, there's no civic capital. Um, this is an older article, but I wanted to. It's from 2019. I get it, but Sudan's been still in this thing where a lot of people are saying we shouldn't let Sudan sink into anarchy, and they say citizens are paying a huge price because the former despot, similar to Mohammed Sayed Barre, who was in Somalia, Omar Bashir was removed from office through protests, and he has been. Right now, the military mediation is happening with the military, and they're controlling the country. And a lot of people want, people like Saudi Arabia and the UAE want a government there and things like that. However, a lot of people in the UN are saying that we can't let this happen. We can't let them fall into this. And the African Union, what they want to do is suspend Sudan from all organizational activities, things like that. And the rest of the world should follow suit. They should, put pressure on Sudan. And there's other more recent articles that I could point to. The reason I'm pointing to this article is because what happened when maybe you don't remember the incident, but like in Somalia, there was always a thing during the Bush years and around then, like, oh, we can't let it fall into anarchy. If we let these nations in sub-Saharan Africa and other places where they have terrible governments, the governments, in my opinion, are worse than anything individuals could do, worse than any Pol Pot, worse than anything, then it would be the end of the world. We can't have this. I'm saying not only should we let Sudan go into anarchy and we should, the UN should back away, but other countries in that region would highly benefit from having their governments go poof. And then, I get it. Empirical stuff isn't everything. And I understand there is going to be violence and problems. It's not a good situation. Sudan's broken up into two countries, North and South. I understand that. I'm not going to say it's going to be Disneyland and social cooperation, love everywhere. But I do think in the long run, even if there is a short-term burst of that Sudan would benefit from sinking into anarchy. And yes, I'm biased. But it could change. The military could put the prime minister back. And that's another option too. But I'm thinking that may not be the best thing. But we'll have to see. But I'd love your perspective on this in third world and African countries. Do you feel okay? Let Sudan go into anarchy, and there might be short-term violence and long-term thing, or would it be better if the military or someone put the prime minister back in Sudan? If you're not familiar with the history or don't want to go into that, that's fine as well.
That case in particular is really difficult, but you can look at Leeson's work when he discusses the nirvana fallacy in Anarchy Unbound, why anarchy works better than you think. So he says, Somalia compared to America, America is a lot better as far as, freedom goes. The problem, freedom and wealth. So you might say that anarchy Somalia is worse than, statusy America, however you would categorize that. That is an inaccurate comparison. A more accurate comparison is Somalia before and after statelessness, whenever it was 91 in that area. I could be totally off on that.
No,
and
you're right.
compare Somalia to its neighboring countries that have a similar history, similar demographics, similar, genetic predispositions. So even something like COVID in Asian countries, you see different numbers than in America. So all these things are so different that you can't compare these two totally different populations and just take one aspect and say, this is better than that. So yes, I would push the button almost in any society. I mean, think of if you had the opportunity to press the button, more than 100 years ago, you would not have had you certainly wouldn't have had the Second World War. You wouldn't have had the First World War with assassinating the Archduke because he sought to increase the power of the Austrian Empire. The British Empire couldn't have declared war on September 3rd, 1939, against Germany. They would have had to form some alliance with France and, whoever was in Germany. I guess the button would have been pushed in Germany as well. But it's so difficult to, account for all these things. The point is that you at least have a glory holiday. And two, remember that having a state doesn't mean you're necessarily secure from this terrible the terrible things that can exist. So if you're looking at countries in Africa or places in America, well, there was mass Native American mistreatment, there was enslavement. In African countries, you had things like the Ethiopian invasion of Somalia, which was horrible. You have events like Rwanda. So even with states, you still get these terrible things. The question is whether or not this terrible thing is going to be highly centralized or I guess I'm trying to think of what a proper comparison would be, because it's just centralization, decentralization. You could say, well, Walmart is centralized heavily. I'd have to think of a better phrasing for it. But if abolition of the state simply means no state services exist, well, then you're probably going to have a better outcome than you otherwise would, as Leeson clearly shows with the case of Somalia, that while it's bad overall, it was better than it otherwise would have been compared to where it was previously and its trajectory and neighboring countries. Somalia outperforming its neighbors, I think, is the article that Tom Woods wrote about it in response, just because it's a fascinating thing to read that. While some places, yes, are still poorer than others, you want to look at much more controlled experiments. So the African example would be Botswana, Zimbabwe. And there is no better indicator as to markets can work both in Western countries and non-Western countries. And Botswana is outperforming Zimbabwe at almost every level. And then North Korea and South Korea is, a group sharing a history and a language and a gene pool, and one without question outperforming the other. So yes, I would press the button in almost every circumstance, because you at least get a glorious holiday.
Yeah, you get a holiday, and you don't have to get coerced, so that's good. And China and Hong Kong, in my opinion, is another one. Like, you look at China, communist China and Hong Kong, and say, wow, that's a night and day difference. So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what happens. But like, a lot of my arguments have been like, at least fine, let's do the Articles of Confederation here, but other places like Sub-Saharan Africa, things like, just let them, like, have them be gone overnight. Like, I wouldn't even, and even with World War I, World War II, I would push the button there. The hard part is the concept of anarcho-capitalism by Rothbard hadn't been invented then, so I don't know what would have happened. It'd be interesting to see, because I'm not very keen. I have no problems with anarcho-primitivism and pacifism, but the syndicalists kind of make me worry. I wouldn't want them in charge of stuff either. The labor theory of, I don't really get their labor theory, of being honest. However,
the labor theory of value is simply false. It's as ridiculous as saying, if a husband works and the wife stays home, she is exploiting his labor. Therefore, marriage should be outlawed. Volunteers don't get compensated in proportion to what they provide for charities. Therefore, volunteer work should be outlawed, because that's stealing their surplus value. Businesses that aren't profitable should be illegal, because they're exploiting the employees, are taking the surplus value from the companies. The labor theory of value is ridiculous. And Adam Smith once believed in it some time ago. So that's a major myth that the Chomskys of the world are so stupid they still believe in.
Yeah, Chomsky was okay before with the foreign policy, but now I'm not liking him on the mandates. But
he gets worse every day. It's shocking. Yeah.
I used to like him on the Middle East stuff, but like I'll even say like the founding fathers are like, Kareem, why you let him off the hook? I think they did the best that they could at the time, and like I don't think the Constitution stopped a lot, but I think they did like the least decentralized thing they could without the philosophy of anarcho-capitalism. So I think classical liberalism was a good road to get there, to push the button, but it may have been hard to push the button before World War One and World War II to me, because you didn't have that, and I don't know what would have worked. Not to say that you couldn't have anarcho-capitalism without reading it, because no one in Somalia, I don't think, read Rothbard after the Barre regime, but still. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. I am kind of an empirical dude. However, I want to thank you for coming back on the show. You can find Keith Knight at Keith Knight on YouTube. Don't tread on anyone, whether it be mandates, taxes, or anything else. Don't tread on them, because the non-aggression principle is the only way to have a civilized society, in my opinion. You can also find him at the One Great Network, Smart Passio's network. If you scroll all the way down, you can find him here. Just click on Keith Knight right next to Larkin Rose, and you can find all of his content here. And that about wraps everything up. So, everyone, I want to thank you for tuning in. If you want to continue the work of Dr. Ron Paul, Murray Rothbard, and the great libertarians that came before us, you can do that at the LP Mises Caucus, lpmisescaucus.com. No more wars, lockdowns, bailouts, or mandates. Just enter your information here and read the resources to learn more about that. Thank you very much for coming back on, Keith. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'm interested to see what way the world goes. More freedom, more totalitarian, or maybe a combination of both. So we'll have to see. I'm hoping it's more freedom-oriented, but we'll see.
Me too. Keep up the good work, Kareem. Thank you for having me on. Bye.
All right. Thank you very much for tuning in to the Essential Libertarian, and I will see you in the next